Today's Interesting Lives does a bit of a departure from the usual. We're going to highlight a bunch of people that are not very well known in history to talk about Joan of Arc, because she is just so damn interesting and her story is so weird. So Jeanne d'Arc was probably born in the year 1412 in the small village of Domremy, which these days is known as Domremy-la-Pucelle, as in Domremy of the Maid, because she was born there. She was actually born in this specific house, we just don't know the exact year. And I know what you're thinking, 1412, isn't that during the 100 Years' War? And yes, actually, that is very much accurate, well done, which is why I'm gonna have to explain the historical context of the 100 Years' War now, which actually lasted 116 years, from 1337 to 1453, I'm fairly certain. And especially important is like the last third of it. So, back then, English and French nobility were very intertwined. I mean, like, the aristocrats of all of Europe were always like a bit of incestuous, you might say, but especially England and France were very connected. The English sovereigns and their family had a lot of holdings in France, which technically made them subjects to the French king, which they didn't like very much because they were like the King of England. The King of England shouldn't be the subject of the King of France just because he has like a basketball court in Paris. And the French always tried to take those lands away from them because after all, those lands were given to them by the grace of the French king. Then, Charles IV of France died without a successor, and like all good dynastic wars, this sparked just generations of conflict because everyone was related to everyone else in different systems of law and interpretations, put different people on the throne. Long story short, the English nobility were of the opinion that the French throne was now theirs by right because one of them had inherited it. Meanwhile, the French nobility was like, no. And the peasants died. In the final third of the 100 Years' War, the French were kind of fucked, both economically and strategically, because in large parts, not only had the English taken all the economic powerhouses of the country, well, almost all of them, and the ones that they couldn't use, all the infrastructure they couldn't use, they just destroyed. So the French coffers were empty and no new dough was rolling in. Charles VI, King of France at the time, suffered from some kind of mental disorder characterized by frequent psychotic and dissociative states, one of the most common of which was that he believed that he was made of glass and always at risk of shattering. The rest of the royal family was caught up in internal power struggles that led to pretty external divisions. A civil war, you might say. So much so that the senior-most members of the family ended up murdering each other and leaving a 14-year-old boy, who would later become Charles VII, nominally in charge of two factions he had no control over and who didn't like each other very much. On one hand, you had the Burgundy faction, which ended up aligning themselves with the English nobility and the English king. And then you had the Armagnac faction, who supported Charles's claim to the throne, mostly because they weren't too fond of the idea of a king from a country that they'd been at war with for like a really long time. Now, because some of you might be confused by this, nationalism back then was really very much in its infancy. People were just ruled by aristocrats, and those aristocrats sometimes were born in other countries and came from other cultures and ethnic groups, and that was just how it was and how it had kind of always been. Dynastic disputes over the line of succession were politically much more relevant than any sort of sentiments of national identity or cohesion. The English king, Henry V, took advantage of the Civil War situation by landing in Normandy and launching a massively successful military campaign across northern France, starting with the Battle of Agincourt, where he defeated the French against all odds, took out a massive chunk of their army, and made the English seem invincible. Isabeau of Bavaria, the Queen of France, granted succession to Henry V over her own child, Charles VII, who was, at this point, not yet crowned King of France. Henry then died very close to when Charles VI did, leaving France utterly rudderless because his own successor, Henry VI, was a literal child too young to be crowned king of anything. Now, when the 14-year-old boy became older and his grip over the Armagnac faction firmer, Charles VII declared himself the Dauphin of France, aka the heir to the throne. There was no king, so you'd think he would just become king. But kings need to be anointed, and in France, that happened right here, in Reims, which was deep in English Burgundian territory alongside Paris and most of the economic powerhouses. So even if he had people supporting his claim, he couldn't actually become king without taking Reims. Enter the young Catholic maiden known as Joan d'Arc. So Domremy was a little off the beaten path, and they had managed to stay loyal to the Armagnac cause even though they were surrounded by Burgundian and English-controlled settlements. It wasn't like a stage of permanent hardcore siege, but life was kinda difficult. Jeanne was the daughter of farmers, and her father also was like a local administrator in town, generally a very well-respected guy. When she was 13, Jeanne received a vision from the Archangel Michael, as well as Saint Margaret of Antioch and Saint Catherine of Alexandria, both martyrs, telling her to go help the Dauphin become king. It took her a couple of years to get around to do that, but when she was 16 or 17, sources disagree because, again, we don't know exactly what year she was born, she went to Vaucouleurs, where there was a garrison of Armagnac loyalists. So this peasant girl, the daughter of a random farmer from some other town that you've never heard of, she goes to the garrison commander Robert de Baudricourt and says, "Hey, that'll be one order of a military escort so I can go to where the king is to help him become the king, actually." And he said, "Nah, dude, that don't sound legit. Please go away." She didn't, though, and soon she received another vision wherein she was told that the Battle of the Herrings, which had been the attempt of the French to ambush a convoy that was going to supply English forces besieging Orleans, had failed. Which, by the way, the Siege of Orleans was going on at the time. It had been going on for like half a year. It was very important. The city, in and of itself, is like, it was a major borderlands metropolis, like right on the border, and it was basically the gateway to conquering the rest of France for the English, and the main bulwark against the English conquering the rest of France for the French. So she told some of the soldiers in the garrison about the vision, and then a couple of days later, a messenger arrived and confirmed the exact thing that she'd said. And so they told their commander, and he was like, I guess, I suppose, you know, you're sent by God, clearly, so have this military escort, put on some man clothes, because a woman being escorted by soldiers kind of attracts attention, and off you go, I suppose. So she and her escort traveled through these Burgundian-controlled lands, always careful not to be caught, because if they were caught, well, you know, problems. And she arrived in Chinon, where the royal court was, to a resounding, "I'm sorry, you what now?" But apparently she was very charismatic, and she did get an audience with the king, who seemed to like her, and apparently she had showed him one of her visions. I don't know how that would have worked. And so he shared the vision, and she was like, "I am going to take you to Reims, and I'm going to make you king, and that's what God wants. Trust me." Now, when someone proclaims to be an agent of God, even in the medieval period, people look at them weird. On one hand, you might just be crazy. People were very much aware of there being mental illness at the time, especially the Dauphin, whose own father, the king, had suffered from mental illness. On the other hand, you may also be an agent of the devil, or just a plain heretic, trying to bring people away from the good path of Catholicism. So Charles contacts the Theological faculty in Poitiers, and they go, "We're going to investigate this woman, test if she's actually a good Catholic," and then the results come in and they're like, "She is obnoxiously Catholic," and this is us saying this, we are literally priests. They also specifically investigated claims that she wore male clothes, which under biblical law is forbidden. However, St. Thomas Aquinas himself created an exception to this. Basically, if you have a good reason, like you don't want to get captured, or maybe you wear armor for protection in battle where people die, or maybe, you know, you're trying to not get raped, that's a good reason, and then you're allowed to break that particular law. Trust me, this will become important later. And so Charles went, "Okay, I'm in, let's do it. But first, you have to prove to me that you're really an agent of God by breaking the siege of Orleans." They made her a suit of armor and gave her a merry little band of traveling companions, one of which was Gilles de Rais, who, just on a quick side note, was one of the most prolific serial killers of all time. Big on child murder and occultism, and sent her out to disrupt English activities. Charles was convinced that she was legit, so he made her a core part of his military strategy. Now, what you need to understand is that this was not normal. This was quite literally a Hail Mary. This was the reaction of a French nobility that was just on the brink of being utterly defeated, not knowing what to do, completely devoid of any hope. This farm girl coming along and proclaiming to be an agent of God was the exact ray of the hope that they didn't have in these dark days. So in large parts, it was just them going, you know what? Fuck it. Let's do this. It literally could not get worse. So Jeanne d'Arc arrives at the French military positions, and the commanders, they're kind of split, because on one hand, I mean, she appears to be sent by God, and the Dauphin thinks she's legit, but on the other hand, she's a random girl, a peasant from some farm half the country away. She didn't even know how to fight. She just stood around with her banner, not killing anyone, but being a symbol and an inspiration to the soldiers. And over the course of her military career, which, you know, was never officially a military career, but she was de facto with the military, she got injured all the time. Arrows, crossbow bolts, fucking swords, you name it, everything. But she never faltered. She always stood fast, and that was very inspiring. And it also turned out that any advice that she gave was solid gold. She said things and they would work, and so more and more of the officers began to be convinced that, well, she's an agent of God. So Jeanne d'Arc somehow managed to turn the Siege of Orleans, which looked very bad for the French at the time, into a French victory through her very aggressive and, you know, traditional wisdom-defying strategies of just going in there and attacking and winning. On the 8th of May 1429, a little over a week after her arrival, the English grip on Orleans was completely broken. They faltered, they were driven away, and it was well enough, because if the city would have fallen to them, they would have annihilated it. Not only was it the founding place of the Armagnac faction, it was also a city that had resisted the siege a lot. And so, it was completely justified that once the new rulers came in, they would punish the city. And to make this clear, we are talking about raping and pillaging here. We are talking about just wanton murder and just letting soldiers, many of which were trained to become psychopaths, just hog wild on a population of people who couldn't defend themselves and who were utterly hated by those very soldiers. But that didn't happen, and it was the biggest French victory in literally decades. And so the Dauphin showed up and went to Joanne and said, let's do it, take me to Reims, let's make an army, we're gonna move into English territory and take me there. Which it wasn't even like something that made a lot of sense strategically, because you could have attacked Paris, you know, one of the core holdings of the English. If you had taken that, then that would have been a massive blow to them. Or their holdings in Normandy, from where they basically coordinated everything. And as they advanced, they did sometimes make it seem as though they were going to attack Paris. And really, they were just a spearhead going like slightly to the side of Paris, and then behind them, fueled by the Maid of Orléans, which was also, you know, was a two-way street, really, the gateway to the south and the north. They managed to take a lot of land away from the English. There was, through Jeanne d'Arc, a massive shift in how people, especially peasants, saw the war. Before, it had just been a big succession game that the rich people played with the peasants as pawns. They didn't really care very much. They weren't particularly invested in this particular lord or marquis or the other. It had been this way for their parents, it had been this way for their grandparents, it had been this way for their great-grandparents. But now the Armagnac French were led by a god-sent farmer's peasant girl. God had picked a side, and common folk cared about that. On the 17th of July 1429, King Charles VII was officially crowned in the Cathedral of Reims, with Joan of Arc standing by the altar, a symbolic moment, after which she suggested they make for Paris for a final victory. But instead, they decided to sue for peace with the Burgundy faction and said, look, if you accept Charles as the king, he has now officially been crowned, then everything will be fine. So Duke Philip of Burgundy said, okay, let's call this a truce, let's all get cooler heads, enter into negotiations, and also reinforce Paris. That he really just wanted to reinforce Paris. During this time, when there was no war going on, Jeanne d'Arc just kind of started writing hate mail to people she didn't like. This isn't like relevant at all, but she dictated like a letter that she sent to the English, said leave France and go with me to fucking Bohemia to fight heretics there. This is something that happened. The English didn't do that, obviously. Also, she and her family were raised into nobility for her crucial role in making the king be the king, so that was kind of cool. Then, when the truce was over, because it had turned out the Burgundians were just stalling, Jean traveled with a regiment of soldiers to Campagne, but instead was ambushed by Burgundian forces set out to capture her, because it turns out, when you become a massive political symbol, people tend to want you dead. So they kept her in captivity for a while, then sold her to the English for a big chunk of change, because really they didn't have much cause to do anything with her except keep her as a prisoner of war, whereas the English had a symbol to destroy. Charles did attempt to negotiate for her release, and numerous rescue operations were launched. It's just that none of them were successful. So she was moved to the city of Rouen in Normandy, where the English ran most of their operations from, and they had a plan not only to get rid of Joanne, but also of her status as a symbol. After all, God is with us, not the French, because they're the French. Obviously, we're the good Christians, so God is with us. And the other guys are bad and wrong, so obviously this person pretending to have God on her side must be lying. So they decided to set up a trial wherein she would be declared a heretic. So that way, the Armagnac faction advancing through France would be not fueled by God, but by the devil, and the King Charles, his legitimacy, would be tainted in the eyes of God, because it was also the work of the devil. So they did the trial, and it was very bad. So as much as people would like to believe that the Catholic Church in the medieval era was all powerful and just constantly did whatever it wanted, this was not so, especially in the realm of ecclesiastical trials and the Inquisition. There were a lot of rules to make these trials fair and prevent false convictions, and the trial of Jeanne d'Arc followed basically none of them. It was presided over by one Bishop Pierre Cochon, who had no place doing that because it wasn't his bailiwick, but he was very pro-English, and the jury was stacked with pro-English clergy, even though that was explicitly not how these things were supposed to be done. The ones that weren't quite pro-English were intimidated by English soldiers. Jeanne was also denied legal counsel, which she was also entitled to. The whole thing was a massive sham, and everybody, including Jeanne, who pointed it out repeatedly, knew it. So in terms of the standard of evidence, imagine the OJ trial, right? But instead of the gloves don't fit, therefore he didn't do it, it's the gloves have 5 fingers on each hand, OJ has 5 fingers on each hand, therefore he did it. Still, Jeanne held her ground very well for an illiterate peasant who was trying to navigate the intricacies of ecclesiastical law that were being posited to her by a bunch of people that had essentially been Jesus lawyers for their entire life. There's this almost legendary question that was asked of her, where they said, are you in God's grace? Now this is a trick question, because if you say yes, that's heresy, because you can't know that, and pretending that you do is heretical. But if you say no, you're basically just pleading guilty to being a heretic. So she goes, well, I don't know. How would I know that? If I'm not, I really hope he gets me into his grace, and if I am, I really hope he keeps me there. Joan of Arc was really fucking smart. Like, even though she was illiterate, pretty sure she had like some extreme savant level intelligence. In the end, in this sham trial, they were only able to find her guilty of 12 of the 67 charges leveled against her, and so the verdict was excommunication and life imprisonment. The English were not happy with this. Now, technically speaking, she would have had to be kept in a church prison for the rest of her life, but for some unbeknown reason, she ended up in a secular prison operated by the English, where she was given a man's clothes. And that was basically the only option that she could safely wear, even though during the trial, she was wearing women's clothes. And it turns out that she actually preferred the man clothes while being in prison, because it's more difficult to rape someone when they're wearing trousers as opposed to a dress. And that was something that almost happened several times. But she had been found guilty of cross-dressing before. However, if you're not a repeat offender, or at least repeatedly convicted, you can't be put to death for heresy. Them's the rules. But now, because she didn't want to get raped, she was a repeat offender. So they put her through another trial where they did sentence her to death. So in this repeat sham trial, they were only able to get her on a technicality that was also, let's be honest, entrapment. Thus, on the 30th of May 1431, Jeanne d'Arc was burned at the stake as a heretic on the marketplace of Rouen. And normally the story would end here with pretty much any other person in interesting lives, but you might say that this inflamed tensions throughout France. People were not very happy that their venerated national heroine and this agent of God had been burned in a bullshit trial. The English had done a lot to make sure she wouldn't be venerated as a martyr, but they failed. That did not work out the way that they wanted it to. Eventually it went so far that the Burgundy faction said to the English, listen, our thing, it was nice, but it's over. What you did with Jeanne d'Arc was a bit fucked up. If I do say so myself, it was massively fucked up. So the Armagnac faction is now my best friend, and I'm gonna support Charles now as king, so please leave. And by please leave, I mean leave, because I do have a weapon. And that is how Joan of Arc essentially ended the 100 Years' War and became probably the biggest national symbol of France. But the story isn't over yet. Almost a quarter century later, when the war was done, her elderly grandmother petitioned King Charles to have the Pope ask the Pope for a retrial of her daughter because she had been excommunicated, she wasn't in heaven, the record should be set straight. So that's what the king did, and the Pope said yes. He instructed the Inquisitor General of France to take another look at that trial. And boy oh boy did the Inquisitor General of France have his hands full, because he looked at the documents and immediately he was like, all of this is just wrong. This isn't how you do an Inquisition trial. What the fuck? It went so far, right, that Pierre Cauchon, the bishop that had presided over the trial, was posthumously excommunicated for how poorly he had managed the whole thing. So Jean was excommunicated by Pope Calixtus III in 1456, and eventually in 1909 was beatified by Pope Pius X, which is when the Pope says that a person was a real good Christian, and Christians are allowed to take her as an example of a good Christian. And then in 1912, she was officially canonized as a saint of the Catholic Church by Pope Benedict XV. Lots of popes involved in this Catholic matter. Now you might have some questions, like for instance, how the fuck did this woman receive visions from God? What? And you know, the legend of Jeanne d'Arc is of course, in many ways, exactly that. A legend. The most important historical primary source we have for the entirety of her story was the trial documents of the original Rouen trial, and we know that those were doctored. There's a lot of speculation among historians on like potential mental illness or neurological disorders, you know, schizophrenia or epilepsy, but she never in any accounts displays any other symptoms aside from the very opportune visions, which has led some to believe that maybe she lied about the visions in order to make, you know, maybe she was just incredibly intelligent and knew that this was the way to go. She understood things or whatever. Maybe she was trying to protect state secrets and King Charles with her visions by making herself into an agent of God. Nobody will ever know. Probably a lot of heroic acts were done by people around her. As legends go, a lot of actions by many people get focused onto one person, but there is no doubt that there was a Jeanne d'Arc and that she was a very charismatic and intelligent leader, an inspiration to France and the French national cause, which she became a big symbol of much later even, and that through her sacrifice she ended over a century of war. She's the kind of larger-than-life figure that every civilization yearns for when things just are completely desperate and there doesn't seem to be any way out. And also, she's the kind of figure immortalized by a kaleidoscope of different interpretations. That is Jeanne d'Arc. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Interesting Lives. Like, comment, subscribe, do all the things. Share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, potentially buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And in that spirit, sorry this took so long again, but not as long as the Helena Blavatsky one. I'm not quite sure who I'm gonna do next. I think next up is someone who was like a bad person, so maybe I'll go like with gangsters or something. And see you around, cunts.